Kathryn Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute and National Review Magazine. And I am so delighted to have Rick Brookhiser here with me. Rick is the author of many books. And specifically, we're here today to talk about Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty. Beautiful documentary, comprehensive documentary. And it really is about the adventure that is American history, this journey with religious liberty. And I apologize for my voice. I have one of those seasonal hiccups, I guess. Rick, what was the genesis of this? Obviously, you've been writing about religious liberty for your entire career. Now, what got you to the point of the documentary?
Well, I think it was a double push. Our executive producer is Thomas Lehrman, and he's been very interested in this topic for a long time. He was very active with the Beckett Fund. He was on their board, I believe, and he's still involved with it. I got into this with one of my last books, Give Me Liberty. It had a chapter on what became the first episode in the film, which was the Flushing Remonstrance, when the Dutch ran New Netherlands and Peter Stuyvesant was very bad to the Quakers. So, and that was an episode that I thought was very dramatic. It was very compelling. It was very moving to me. Now, Thomas Lehrman and I had worked together on a previous documentary, so we already had a feel for it, and we had a team. Leo Eaton had been the director of that, director and producer. Gary Griffin was the director of photography. So when we were thinking of, well, what should we do next? It was Thomas's interest plus my interest growing out of this one episode. And then we thought, well, let's carry the story forward. Let's not leave it in the 17th century. Let's bring it up to today.
What's different? Obviously, you do so much writing, and I personally am fascinated when I've watched you in the office writing, because you are a bit of a machine when you get to work, at least from the outside. That's what it looks like. But what's different about doing a documentary versus the writing?
Oh, it's much, from my point of view, it's much more relaxing because it's not all me. I mean, I'm the host. I contributed to the writing. I mean,
Sure.
The director, Leo, who unfortunately died in the home stretch of making this movie, and
I saw you dedicated it to him.
Yes, and John Paulson stepped in and did a wonderful job finishing it and bringing it home. But Leo wrote a lot of it. Thomas wrote a lot of it. So, and then I don't have to man the camera. I don't have to work the sound. I don't have to edit it. I mean, a lot of other people are doing stuff. So for me, it's easier.
When you get to travel.
You get to travel. Yes, you get to.
You did some international shots.
Yes, well, yes, for the segment about New Netherlands, we went to Old Netherlands to give a little background as to how Peter Stuyvesant gets his job and who were his bosses and so on. And then we traveled around the United States, and we went to James Madison's house. So that was kind of classy and founding fathers-ish. We went to the first church of the AME church in Philadelphia. So that's historic in a different way. And it had a statue of Richard Allen, their first minister, who had been a slave, was freed himself. His master allowed him to work for money, and he bought his own freedom, which sometimes happened. And then he very dynamically founded this independent Black church. We went to Salt Lake. We interviewed a number of Mormons there. It was interesting. I would say the thing that I learned. I mean, I sort of knew about many of the topics we covered, and among them is the story of the Mormons. And I knew they'd been badly treated. I really didn't know how bad it was. And I was very struck when we were in Salt Lake. Every Mormon that we interviewed said, not making a big deal of it, but it just came up. They would say, well, my great grandfather was imprisoned, or my great grandmother died of typhus in Nebraska on the way west. And these people, they were treated so badly, they had to leave the United States. That's what they finally do. They said, we got to go to Mexico. Well, as they were en route, we won the Mexican War, so they ended up back in the United States, but it was so remote that they could they could do what they wanted to do for the longest time.
And as a historian and as an American citizen, does it just make you all the more convicted about the importance of religious liberty and both knowing the history and lighting a fire under people to 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 protect it?
Well, you see two things. You see a lot of problems and you see a lot of struggles, but you also see, and certainly with the Revolutionary War and then the Constitution, you see a formal commitment to this, to free exercise. I mean, that's what you learn from the visit to Montpelier, James Madison's house, and his particular interest in this, which was lifelong.
Mm-hmm.
And he was concerned about religious liberty in his 20s before the revolution even begins, because there was persecution in colonial Virginia in the next county, Culpeper County. Baptist ministers were being imprisoned because there was an Anglican establishment at that time. And this outraged him. I think it outraged him because his own mind and his own thoughts were so important to him. He was such an intellectual person. And the idea that people were being jailed because of their thoughts and the conclusions that they came to got to him in a personal way. And then the revolution happens, the Constitution is being written, and these interests of his continue. So that's where the commitment comes from. And so throughout history, when new people arrive in this country bearing religious beliefs that seem, unusual, or unusual in such numbers. There have always been Jews and Catholics in what became the United States back in the 17th century, but, a handful. But then when there start being millions, then people are like, oh, what's going on?
Right.
But it's not just immigrants. It's also people coming up with or feeling that they have a new connection to God and how he should be worshiped, and we want to do it this way. And other people, saying, well, gee, why are they doing this, or that's wrong? And so there always, tensions regularly recur and arise, and they have to be worked out. And it's not always, even now that the new religion or the religion that's protesting gets its way. I mean, for instance, the Mormons don't practice plural marriage anymore.
Right.
And they say we got a revelation that it is no longer necessary for this time. Well, at the same time, there was also a political situation that they wanted to be a state. They kept applying and applying and applying, and they hadn't gotten it. Well, once let's say once the revelation came down, then statehood could occur. So, but so there is an ongoing tension. And I think probably the best line in the whole show, maybe the second best, it's my friend Akhil Amar, professor at Yale Law School. And he said, religious liberty will not survive unless it survives in the hearts of the American people. If they want to preserve it, then it will, because there is the First Amendment, there's a legal precedence, there's a formal structure. But if people don't want it, if they stop caring about it, it'll fall by the wayside.
Mm. Now, are you concerned that we don't have the same,
Oh, no,
place
no,
the same
well, I'm
values?
not. Look, people, it's not up to me. People keep bringing this up. It keeps happening. We ended the film. The last of the 7 segments is everything from World War II to now. So we have very recent Supreme Court cases. We've got this wonderful footage about the RFRA Act. This was the response to the Supreme Court case, which rejected the argument that it was religious free exercise to be able to use peyote in a Native American religion. And I think it was Justice Scalia who wrote the opinion, shooting that down. Well, then Congress, rose up in its wrath and it passed this act basically rebuking the court. So we have this wonderful footage of Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy agreeing on this, and in their wide, loud '90s neckties. I mean, it was that was fun to see. But and even more recent cases than that. So this is still churning, it's still happening, and people do still care about it. So I don't think it will wither or go away. But I thought Akil saying that was a very important note to have in there.
One of the controversies that's come up in recent years is this idea that perhaps freedom to worship is different than free exercise. That maybe liberal society is okay, current liberal society, which is really secular in many regards, is okay with you if you want to worship inside your temple, inside your church. But if it starts to, for instance, you don't want to cover contraception and you're the Little Sisters of the Poor, now you're asking for a little too much. Are we developing our relationship to religious freedom in that way, or is it just it's a conflict that that's playing out?
Well, that's always been there. I mean, when we went to Holland to give the backstory for what happened in New Netherlands, the future New York, the Dutch in the 17th century were practicing toleration, and you could do whatever you wanted in your churches, and they didn't have signage or they didn't have external symbols. People would go into these buildings, you'd hear singing in there, and then they'd all come out. But, no one was asking questions about what was going on in there. And that was certainly a lot better than religious warfare, which is what had been going on. But in the New World and then in the United States, it became something more. It became free exercise. And like, as you say, this will always come up. And sometimes the free exercise part of it doesn't win. Plural marriage, again, I mean, there are some religious practices which, will not be defended. Let me put it that way. Right. But many have to be because of what free exercise means. And that was one of Madison's innovations when the Virginia Bill of Rights was being written. George Mason wrote most of it, wrote the first draft, and his language was toleration, which is the language of John Locke. But James Madison was like 24 years old. He said, no, it's got to be free exercise, because toleration implies a tolerator. Maybe the tolerator will change his mind someday.
Right.
You don't. No, this is not something that someone is giving to you as a gift. This is something that you are entitled to as a person.
You would have appreciated, I was at an International Religious Liberty Conference last week, and J.D. Vance actually quoted from Madison and talked about his interest in the church fathers and Tertullian in particular. Again, speaking not only to Madison's commitment to his own words and thoughts and wanting to defend them, but having a rootedness in history, the history that came before us that we need to preserve in our experiment, which you say remains the greatest experiment in religious liberty in world history.
Well, let me tell you what my favorite segment is.
Please.
Well, it's the one I started with. It's the Flushing Remonstrance. And what this was, New Netherlands, which is now New York, the Dutch, that was a Dutch colony. And they sent over a governor general, Peter Stuyvesant, who was a military guy. He'd lost his leg in battle with the Spaniards. He was actually a pretty good governor general in a lot of ways, and I'm sort of sorry he comes off as a total villain in our show, which he wasn't. But he was a tyrant, and it was my way or the highway. And his father had been a Dutch Reformed minister, so as far as he was concerned, Calvinism was the only way. And he started off. He leaned on Jews, he leaned on Lutherans. Now, when he did that, he'd get his chain yanked by his bosses back in Amsterdam, because they would say, look, we've got investors and directors in our company here who are Lutherans and Jews, and cut this out. So he'd obey them. But Quakers had no directors or investors in the Dutch West Indies Company. So when Quakers start showing up in his colony, he's appalled. And what's he going to do? Well, he imprisons one of them and whips him almost to death. Finally lets him go and chases him out. Other people he just puts on a ship and gets out of there. There were women who were Quaker women who were like preaching in the street so loudly people thought there was a fire. So then he says, okay, anybody who hosts Quakers, that will be a crime. And any ship that brings them in, that is a crime. So he's trying to keep them out before they even get in. And then he gets a document from the town of Flushing, which is still a neighborhood, in Queens. It was a little village. And 32 men sign this, and they very respectfully address him, and they say, we cannot follow this directive. And because we would do unto others as we would have others do unto us. And our Savior saith, this is the law and the prophets. And what I love about that, first of all, it's not wise rulers saying this. This is not James Madison. It's not President Lincoln telling Ulysses Grant you can't kick Jews out of your military district. It's not the Supreme Court or Congress. These are ordinary people. The second thing is they're not doing it for themselves. They're not Catholics or Mormons or Black Methodists, sticking up for their own rights. They're sticking up for the rights of other people, who are not themselves. Then the third thing is, this isn't the Enlightenment speaking. They're saying our Savior says this is the law and the prophets. So this is a religious argument that they are making. And I just find that whole thing, it's so moving. And of the guys who signed this, the men who signed this, 6 of them couldn't sign their names. They made marks, and then the town clerk said, okay, that's the mark of this person. He wrote the name. But they laid down a marker.
And with tremendous conviction and courage.
And courage, and then Stuyvesant, he arrests them. He leans hard. And some of them recant. I mean, the most prominent ones are the ones he threw in jail, and they did recant. Because they're all alone. They're here on this side of the Atlantic Ocean with a guy that no one can contradict. The only people who can rein Peter Stuyvesant in are across the Atlantic Ocean in Amsterdam. So, yeah, we might wish they would have been martyrs, but no, they didn't. So they recanted. But before they did that, they made this statement. And it was so moving to go up to Albany, New York, where they have it. They have the actual thing is there in the archives of New York State.
that question of recanting, as some of the most impressive people I've encountered in my life are the ones, say, in Iraq, Christians who were faced by ISIS, and the question is, will you just play along?
Mhm.
They don't play
And they don't play along.
It's amazing.
Right.
But I will never judge someone who doesn't play along, that's for sure. It is tremendous the lengths people have gone to secure this freedom for us.
Mhm.
Just earlier today, I actually had an Uber driver who I'm one of the people who talks to my Uber drivers, and always an interesting story or exchange. He was a Jehovah's Witness. That's probably, if we're not Jehovah's Witnesses, we don't think about it a lot, but you have a mention of when they had to go to court because they didn't want to take an
Pledge of
oath in the Pledge of
Allegiance. That's
Allegiance.
right.
Yeah. Another example of,
And it happened twice. I mean, the first court case they lost,
right.
and then the second court case they won, not on free exercise grounds, but free speech grounds.
Mhm.
But it had the result that they were able to follow their religious convictions. But Justice Jackson said, there's no principle more important than you can't compel people to say things that they don't believe. So therefore, the kids didn't have to say the
Mhm.
pledge.
You mentioned Albany, and if we come back downstate, we're recording this in New York at the National Review offices. There's such rich religious liberty history in New York, some of which you get into. Maybe could you talk a little bit about the Catholic
Oh,
experience?
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's New York and Philadelphia were the two places where we filmed. One place in New York was Old St. Patrick's Church. I mean, St. Patrick's Church now is this big, beautiful Gothic revival thing
Right.
on Fifth Avenue. But before that, there was a St. Patrick's Church, which is now downtown,
Mhm.
and it's surrounded by a wall.
Mhm.
And I had seen it, and I sort of wondered, why do they have this wall? Well, they built the wall because there was anti-Catholic rioting in the early 19th century, and Bishop Hughes, nicknamed Dagger
Sure.
John because of his signature, but I think also because of his personality,
Right.
he ordered this wall to be built, and he let it be known that there'd be snipers behind it if there was going to be another riot.
Mhm.
Another church had been burned in a previous riot. Then also Philadelphia was even worse. These riots were called the Bible riots. The question was, what Bibles would be used in public schools? Because they were using Bibles in public schools for instruction. So the Protestants wanted the King James Bible to be used. Catholics didn't want to use it. They asked, well, it's interesting that Bishop Hughes first asked, well, can Catholic kids use the Catholic Bibles in their schools? And then when that didn't fly, he said, okay, no Bibles at all. If those are the rules, let's have no Bibles at all. But back to Philadelphia, there were riots over this. A Catholic church was burned to the ground. A convent was burned to the ground. And then the militia got organized. The state and city government had been taken by surprise by this. But after a couple of weeks passed, the governor had his act together, the militia had its act together, and when the mob next attacked another Catholic church, which we filmed in, there was a battle outside, and both sides had cannons. The militia had their own cannons well mounted. The rioters grabbed some, barrels off a ship in the harbor, and 20 people were killed in this on either side. And this church was saved, and we filmed in it
Mhm.
because it was not burned, and we filmed with the with the priest there, who we asked him, what do you think the parishioners here would have been thinking during this time? And he said, well, I can just imagine they saved, they gave, they donated to build this church, and this is at risk. This is going to be attacked, burned. I mean, this is really a threat to one of the most important things in your life. So of course they want to protect it.
One of the things I love to see in Catholic churches in New York is so many of the family dedications on the stained glass windows. I mean, you see the immigrants who poured themselves into building these churches. And it also is remarkable, Old St. Patrick's in particular, to just go to regular mass there and realize this history. And that's actually the church where pro-lifers very often do their prayerful witness, because Planned Parenthood's right down the block.
Mhm.
And so you kind of see the continuing free exercise play out with, often there have to be police there because they're protesters, and it's the fight for religious freedom is playing out right in real time there with a backdrop of history.
Right. I don't think it got in the film, but Father Gravy, who was the pastor there when we filmed, I remember him telling me you can see the generations of different kinds of people who worshipped here. I mean, it's Old St. Patrick's, so that's pretty Irish, but a lot of the windows donated by Italian Americans or reflect Italian
There's Cuomo on
stains.
one of the windows. I always
Okay,
wonder if there's a
there you go.
relation.
But then there's also a shrine to a particular saint who was very uh, popular, but beloved in Vietnam.
Right,
So,
right.
so it's for Asian American parishioners, because Chinatown is right,
Right there.
right down there. So you can see the different waves of people who've been there.
Yeah, it is remarkable. Talk a little bit about the Jewish experience, including in the Civil War in the South, which I don't think many people think about.
Right. Well, this is an episode in the life of Ulysses Grant, and he started in the Western theater, trying to wrest the Mississippi Valley from the Confederacy. And one of his early bases was Paducah, Kentucky, which is where the Cumberland River goes into the Ohio. And the Cumberland River will take you down to Nashville. I mean, it's a road right into the South. So this is an important spot. Grant's trying to win the war. One of his tasks that he is assigned is to monitor the cotton trade, which is winked at by both sides. Both the Union and the Confederacy want to allow a certain amount of trading in cotton, even though they're at war, because both sides get money from it. Also, alongside this, there are smugglers. If you can't get a legitimate license, well, you'll try and smuggle it out because a lot of money can be made. And this is in Grant's lap. This is the last thing in the world he wants to have to deal with. And so he is told, he believes that a lot of the smugglers are Jewish. So he issues an order, General Order 11, expelling all Jews from his military district. A resident of Paducah named Caesar Kaskil, who was a Jewish man from Prussia originally. And he decides, he's been told he's got to leave in 24 hours. So he said, I'm going to go to Washington. I've got to take this to the president. He grabs the first steamboat he can get. Unfortunately, it's going the wrong way, so he's got to get another one that takes him back up the Ohio. Then in Cincinnati, he meets a Republican congressman who gives him an entree to Lincoln. When he gets to Washington, D.C., he gets in to see Lincoln. Lincoln hasn't heard of this. This is all news to him, the president, and he says, well, this cannot be. I countermand this. You can't blame everybody for the misdeeds of a few. So, this order is countermanded. And, Grant, to his credit, I mean, he obeyed. Okay, fine, we're not going to do this anymore. And then years later, when he becomes a politician and he's running for president and wins, he goes out of his way to make amends. He appoints more Jewish men to federal jobs than all his predecessors put together. That's partly because they're just more federal jobs, but he wants to make a point. When a synagogue opens in Washington, I think it was the second one in Washington, he goes to the opening service, and it's like 3 hours. But, he goes and he sits there. And he appointed some Jewish diplomats to parts of Europe where pogroms were beginning to happen. So he really does try to make amends. But this was a very dramatic and alarming thing to the Jewish community, that for a few days there, the representative of the government of the United States was saying, okay, all you Jews have got to get out. And this seemed very much like what they'd left behind in Europe. And then the second part of that episode has to do with the lynching of Leo Frank, who was a young Jewish man. He worked for a pencil factory in Atlanta, and one of his employees, Mary Fagan, who was a girl, was found murdered after she had gotten her paycheck from Frank. So he was accused of having done the crime. He protested his innocence throughout. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. There was a national uproar because the trial had been like a carnival. The governor of Georgia commuted the sentence, but then a mob grabbed him from the jail in Atlanta and took him to Mary Fagan's hometown and hanged him there. And I will say there was a musical done about this called Parade. And we interviewed the man who wrote the book of that musical, who belonged to the family that had employed Leo Frank. His family had owned the pencil factory way back when, so he had a personal connection to this. Parade was revived not long ago. It brought it back on Broadway, and Nazis picketed it.
Wow.
There were Nazis who came out and said he killed Mary Fagan. And I've seen that online. I mean, when I doom scroll, and all the madness among it, I saw a couple, like Nazi-ish things about that. Wow. So there's still people holding on to that. Wow. Holding on to that story. But the effect of this lynching was the founding of a lot of Jewish organizations in America that still exist. And it probably also helped induce Woodrow Wilson to put Louis Brandeis on the Supreme Court, as kind of an official rebuke to what had gone on there.
Somehow we've been talking for over a half hour and we haven't mentioned George Washington and his contributions to religious liberty.
Yes, well, speaking of Jews, Washington as president, he thought he should go to every state. He'd been to a lot of states during the Revolutionary War, but he thought, I've got to go to all of them. And Rhode Island was the last one because, of course, Rhode Island was the last to ratify the Constitution. So he's not going to go there until they actually sign on. Finally, they do. And he goes to Newport, and wherever he goes, everybody turns out, and he gets all these memorials from this, that, and the other, whatever. And among them was a tribute from the synagogue in Newport, the Touro synagogue in Newport. And they thanked him for coming, and we hail your administration, and we're so glad that religious toleration is practiced in this country. And then he writes back, and why, thank you for your thanks, all this politeness. But he says, it's not toleration here. We don't do that. It is free exercise. That's what you have here. And it's an example of this man who we don't think of as an intellectual, but it shows, he was thoughtful. Mm-hmm. He knew what this was all about. He really got it, and he was able very graciously to correct and instruct the beneficiaries, who, of course, are not just the members of that congregation, but everybody.
And is that farewell address he gave as important as religious freedom advocates often say it is?
No, I think it would be the letter to the synagogue.
It is.
The farewell address, My personal view as a biographer, I find it a little instrumental.
Mm,
It's like saying, yeah, people should be religious because it makes you better citizens,
mhm.
which is,
True.
true, but that isn't the main reason.
Right.
But okay, but maybe that's all a president should say.
Mm,
That's the other half of it. But I think for free exercise purposes, it's really that letter that he writes to the Truro Synagogue. And there was a Jefferson biographer who said, "Oh, well, Jefferson went along on the trip to Rhode Island, so he probably ghosted the letter for Washington." Well, that'd be fine. I mean, Washington used ghosts all the time, although he edited them very carefully. But I think more recent scholarship says, no, Jefferson didn't write that.
okay.
This was his regular secretary at the time, David Humphreys, and and whoever it was, Washington always edited whatever went out over his signature.
I should mention, if you're watching this live, please put questions in the chat box. Is that correct, Frank? In the background, thank you. If you have any questions for Rick, I can certainly fill the hour, but I know many people have come on to ask questions directly themselves, and we encourage that. You mentioned, Rick, at one point in the documentary, we have this instinct now, many, to condemn things in history that weren't quite right and contradictory even. One of the examples would be there was a time where there was preaching of salvation and yet there was segregation, and that led, among other things, you mentioned Richard Allen and you mentioned the Baptists. Can you talk a little bit about that history and what we can learn from that, sort of correcting ourselves along the way?
Well, the first anti-slavery writing in what became America, it was still the 13 colonies. Now, this is not in the documentary, but it was some converts to Quakerism, some recent converts. I think they were German Americans. And they wrote a memorial to their fellow Quakers saying, well, how can we do this? Uh, George Fox, when he came to North America, he preached to slaves and to American Indians and to Quakers and to people who weren't Quakers. I mean, he preached to everybody, but it didn't occur to him to say that slavery was wrong. But he took the message to people who were enslaved. But as time passes, and this is 1688 was this first document, people began to draw the conclusion that if these are our fellow believers, um, we cannot hold them in slavery. This is treating them as less than men, and that this is in fact unchristian. And the Quakers themselves concluded as a denomination in the mid 18th century that this is a corporate position. If you continue to hold slaves, we expel you from meeting. So that's what they do to people who did unquakerish things. You'd get expelled from the meeting. If you were a woman and dressed immodestly, sorry. But this now joins the list. And then obviously this becomes an issue. It becomes a political issue. A lot of the personal manumissions in the 18th century, some of them are, you might call them political or ideological. When George Washington frees his slaves in his will, I think that's as Washington as a revolutionary leader, does not want to go down in history as an owner of men. He sees the contradiction. He understands the contradiction. And in his last will and testament, he's going to remove that. And Richard Allen actually hails him for it in a eulogy that he delivered in Philadelphia. But the other manumissions, there was Robert Carter, fantastically wealthy Virginia planter, and he becomes a Baptist. Then he becomes a Swedenborgian, follower of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a kind of a mystical Swedish scientist. And he frees 500 slaves. I think it's like the biggest manumission, personal manumission, and that was for religious reasons. There was also a Quaker merchant, last name of Pleasance, who just before the revolution, he directed that, again, in his will, like 70, maybe 90 people that he had owned should be free. And that went in court. I mean, because some of his heirs said fine and others said, oh no, we want this property. And this was a long, long legal battle. So a lot of the manumissions that did occur were often for religious reasons. Someone felt, their heart was turned, was moved, and so that's what they did. But of course, the solution that finally ended up happening, I mean, it was this horrible war, and then it was politics. It was the victory of the Republican Party, and then it was the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the 13th Amendment. So it took the intervention of the state and also the arms to end it finally.
I should mention that the documentary we're talking about, Free Exercise, is available on Apple TV and I have to get my list here. It's Prime Video, Fandango at Home. I'm not even sure what that is. Google Play and Vimeo on demand.
We're too old.
Yeah. Well, I remember a time when you said you would never go on Twitter, and now it's called X. It's not even Twitter anymore.
Oh,
and you did.
There I am.
Why did you convert?
I like it. And I like talking to my followers. I mean, there are certain regulars who often pop up and they're interesting. They know stuff that I don't know, and or they're amusing or they're combative sometimes, but they're always polite. So it's good.
That's what has always been one of my favorite things about the internet, the instant access you get to readers, who sometimes know a lot about very specific issues too.
You bet. I'm always learning stuff.
That's actually how I met Andy McCarthy back in the day.
Oh, okay.
I thought either this man is crazy or we didn't even have Google then. I Netscaped him, I guess.
We have a question in the chat box.
Right,
here.
please.
What should be the response to a faith that as part of their doctrine believes in overthrowing the government? In other words, are there any legitimate boundaries to free exercise of religion?
Sure. We just talked about one, plural marriage. So yeah, and that isn't even overthrowing the government. It was just overthrowing hundreds of years of the way people thought about marriage, and the political system said, well, no, we're not going to tolerate this. And there are still Mormon schismatics today. I mean, the church, the LDS, does not approve of them, but they are what I guess you'd call them heretics or schismatics. They say, well, we're really doing the thing, and the LDS says, well, no, that's not what it is now.
That was a big moment for the Mormon Church when Mitt Romney ran for president, wasn't it?
Yes, and we interviewed him. He gave a very nice, very good interview. And, we picked him because we figured he is the best known Mormon in America. And he gave us a very, very gracious interview.
You, as part of the documentary, the Beckett Fund participated at one point. You interviewed some friends of National Review and many of us personally, Robbie George being one of them, Rick Arnett at Notre Dame. Was there anything particular in those encounters that you were surprised by or you thought were particularly important points?
Well, Robbie George is always very well spoken.
Yes.
And, we got to interview him right in Nassau Hall, which was what Princeton was when James Madison was there. That was the building. That was it. And, he got to show us James Witherspoon's portrait. And that was the man who ran Princeton, then Presbyterian minister, and from whom Madison learned a lot about politics and how to think about politics and how to think about human rights. And Robbie explained that all with his typical clarity and panache.
When did you decide that you would focus on American history, which you
When did
seem
I
to enjoy?
decide?
Yeah, which you seem to enjoy so much. That certainly comes through in your writing and in your speaking, storytelling.
Well, I've been working in National Review since 1977. I mean,
And how old were you at the time? Very young.
well, I was left college. I was 22. I was an intern, summer intern in 76. And then I came to work here and I've stuck like a barnacle ever since.
Thanks be to God.
But well, what I mostly did was political coverage. I'd cover campaigns. And I thought that was just the most fun thing in the world. When I was a reader, I would read Jack Kilpatrick's campaign coverage. And there's still a paragraph that he did on the 1972 Democratic Convention that made me want to do this. It was so poignant and so beautiful. It was about John McCormack, who was the Speaker of the House, addressing the convention, and no one's paying attention.
Oh, wow.
Because it's the new age and they're all, talking among themselves. And he compared him to like a heron on a stump in a swamp. Anyway, okay, so that's what I was doing. And then in the 90s, I'm trying to think of the third book. What's it going to be? Can't think of anything. Then my agent, who's been my agent ever since, Michael Carlisle, he did a typical agent's or editor's trick. He said, if you can't think of an idea, think of 10. Think of 10. So I thought of 10. And then my wife, Jeannie, said, well, add Washington to that list. And so I did. And then Michael looked at the list and he said, that's the one I can sell. Yes, there it is. So having gotten a contract, then I had to really bear it down and do it. Now, why did Jeannie say add Washington to the list? When I was an undergrad, I was at Yale, class of 77, and two things: Gary Wills and Colonel Trumbull. Gary Wills taught a class on Jefferson. He was getting ready to write Inventing America, his Jefferson book. But and he clearly liked Jefferson. He thought Jefferson was fascinating. But he also talked about Washington, and he clearly loved Washington. There's just a different quality to the way he talked about Washington. That got my attention. Colonel Trumbull had been dead for many, many decades, but he had left his life work, the 8 paintings he did of the American Revolution, and also a standing life-size portrait of Washington after the Battle of Trenton. He left them to Yale College. And he designed a gallery to hold them, and then new galleries, they've been moved and rehung. And so I saw them there in the Yale Art Gallery, and it got my attention, as art is meant to do. And I thought, well, this is, here are these 9 paintings, and Washington is in 5 of them. That tells you something. It told me something. And so then years later, when I'm trying to think of an idea, and then my wife says, add Washington to the list. So, and then the rest is, well, it's not history, it's my history.
Did you wind up going back to that list and writing anything else that was on there?
I don't remember what the,
You don't remember?
I did go back to John Trumbull.
Right.
He was my last book, which is,
I think we have up there.
which is really autobiography. I mean, it's not about me at all, but it's about someone doing, much better than I have done, the same thing, pointing to these men. I mean, I can't be those men myself, but I can point to them. I can say, look, here they were. Here's what they did. And here's the story of how it happened.
Mhm. And you do it amazingly well.
Well,
You're a great storyteller.
thank you.
Frank, do we have any other
Yes,
questions
we
you
have
wanted
a
to
question
bring up?
from Ben Myers here. I don't know if you covered this and I just missed it, but what would you say about separation of church and state? I recently encountered someone upset with the SCOTUS ruling allowing the football coach to pray on the field.
Remind me the case. Was that like a state school or something?
I think it was a state school.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting now. I
That
confess.
that must be why there was even
Yeah, right,
why
right.
it would even come up in a court case. Well, free exercise. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And even before that, before the Bill of Rights, the Constitution said there shall be no religious tests for holding office under the federal government. And then with the post-Civil War amendments, the court has decided that they incorporate the Bill of Rights to the states. The establishment of religion clause left states free to have state established religions, and some states kept it up till the 1820s, but then they all fell by the wayside. So a consequence of free exercise is a large degree of separation. I mean, there has to be, because how could you have free exercise if the state could like tax you to support a particular church or tax you to support the church of your choice? Suppose you had no church, or suppose you were like a Baptist who very much had a church that you really care about, but you don't want the state having its hands on money that goes to it. I mean, that was their position. Back in Virginia, in the times of the early republic, Patrick Henry proposed a law saying, well, let's have a tax, it can be divvied up and you can direct your tax money to go to whichever church you want. And the Baptists said, no way. We don't want the state being involved at all.
The fact that we don't remember the details of a fairly recent Supreme Court case speaks to the fact that this is just an ongoing
Ongoing
deliberation.
stuff.
Yeah.
It was, by the way, it was a public high school in Washington
It was
State.
There you go.
Yeah,
Sure.
okay, that's what I thought. Well, do we have more questions?
Yeah, we have
that you wanna-
another
okay,
question.
We'll let one more person.
Sure. How significant was Roger Williams' experience in establishing religious freedom in Providence and the development of James Madison's views on religious freedom?
I don't know that Madison was influenced by Williams. This came up in making the film of the Maryland Toleration Act, which was, Maryland was founded by Lord Baltimore to be a colony that Catholics could worship in. And famously, it has a Toleration Act, which uses the language free exercise. Now, it was somewhat limited. It was only for Trinitarians. If you denied the Trinity, you could be executed. Although they never did that.
Which I don't think the Trinity would appreciate.
The Trinity might have some views
Yes.
on the matter. Roger Williams is interesting because his devotion to religious freedom, as I understand it, is because he thought everyone else was so reprobate. Just might as well let them all go to hell in their own way. I mean, he thought John Winthrop was a tool of the Pope. Gary Wills said that would be like thinking Douglas MacArthur was a tool of Stalin. It was really out there. So if you think John Winthrop is a tool of the Pope, well, why not have Quakers and Native Americans and this, that, and the other? Let them do it. Now he had his opinions. As an old man, he came out to confute George Fox, one of the great Quaker evangelists, when he showed up in Rhode Island. And Roger Williams, he wrote these pamphlets punning on Fox's name endlessly. Fox digged out of his burrows, because he thinks this is terrible. But, fine, let him come here and say it. I mean, he's wrong, you all go to hell, but I'm not going to stop you.
I think we're about out of time, but
So we'll end on that jolly note.
yeah, well, no, I was going to ask you, what is your encouragement to people to watch? Why should they watch this documentary? What do you hope people get out of it? Sort of who's the audience?
Well, the audience, I mean, the prime audience would be devout Americans, but I think also all Americans, because these are very American stories. I think the stories are all interesting.
They are.
Even
Yeah.
if you're not interested in religion, these are interesting stories. They're varied. You go all around the country, different kinds of people, different times. But I think the takeaway, I go back to what Professor Akil Omar said, you know, unless this lives in the hearts and minds of the American people, it's not going to live.
And again, you can see Free Exercise, America's Story of Religious Liberty on major streaming services. If you Google, and there's a website, freeexercisemovie.com. And Frank, why do you think this movie is important?
Well, I think that a big part of our
Documentary.
country's history has been religious pluralism. And, you know, we often say kind of as a platitude that this is a Judeo-Christian country, but that is in a lot of ways not encompassing of all the many different religions we have here. And I think just, you know, Rick does such an amazing job in this documentary, learning about perhaps denominations that aren't often spoken about, or that are spoken about in a way that's not representative of them. So it's incredibly educational. And I'll post a link to everyone who watched this so they can watch for themselves.
And I encourage people who watch this live or watching after the fact to share it. It's not a propaganda piece. It's a well done story. And it's our story. And so thank you, Rick, for doing it. And thank you for making the time to talk about it and having to listen to my scratchy voice.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Rick.